Hello there and welcome friends. By viewer request, this is a guide on the best throwing axes in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous and how to find them. Now it might not seem that way, but throwing axes are actually very competent weapons. The main benefit over other ranged weapons like crossbows and bows, especially composite longbows, is that you can actually dual wield throwing axes, as I have my Wendweb doing here. So one axe on our main hand and another throwing axe on the offhand. This lets us achieve a massive amount of attacks per round, 3 alone just from dual wielding. We actually end up with 3, 6, 9 ranged throwing axe attacks per round, certainly enough to cleave demons apart. Now before we get started on our list, I think it's also important to explain how throwing axes work. For damage, they actually use your strength. So here we have Wendwag's strength bonus added to her throwing axe damage on hit. Basically the same as a composite longbow. Notice how all of the throwing axes have the strength property by default. So as I've just said, you always get your strength bonus added to their damage. It says bow here, but that's a mistake I think. Meanwhile, when it comes to attack bonus, throwing axes use your dexterity modifier, just as any other ranged weapon. So it does actually pay off to have your throwing axes character have both decent amounts in strength and dexterity, and since it is very easy to increase your strength with the aid of size enhancing spells plus 6 alone from legendary proportions here, you can mostly focus on dexterity and increase that during level ups. And it's not just about attacks per round, because you also get quite a lot of damage on every single one of your hits, something around 70 to 80 with my Wendwag, but during battle it's actually a lot higher because this is missing some of the enchantments we have added to our hits. And it's also important to note that pretty much all of the ranged feats also apply to throwing weapons. For example, precise shot, point blank shot, deadly aim, and so on. Now the only difference is that the many shot feat will not work with throwing axes, as it states in the description, as many shot only applies to bow attacks. Still, we have enough damage per hit with our throwing axes as is, that the lack of many shot won't really reduce our damage. And remember, I already have a guide on how to build your Wendwag as a dual wielding axe thrower. So let's get started on our list, and as usual this will be in order of availability, how early you can find each of these throwing axes. Alright, so for the early game, especially during chapter 1, well, as usual we'll pretty much have to make do with the early version of Finian. There isn't really any other special throwing axe, at least not for chapter 1. And I already have a guide explaining what makes Finian so powerful, that you can check, link down below or to the side here. You can, however, get started into throwing axes as soon as you finish the first dungeon of the game, so whenever you reach the tavern area you can already buy a few throwing weapons, but they will be just normal throwing weapons. Now I'm pretty sure in the early game you can also find a +1 throwing axe, it's just +1, but because we want to actually do a wield throwing axes, you can make use of this by having Finian on your main hand and your +1 throwing axe on your offhand. But of course, if you prefer to leave Finian for other characters, then you can certainly make do with just a normal throwing axe and then a throwing axe +1. Remember that even in the early game you can always use the magic weapon spell to add at the very least a +1 enhancement bonus to your normal unenchanted weapons. And later you can increase that value with the greater magic weapon spell. Alright, so during chapter 2 you also get another throwing axe. And this one a lot more powerful than the initial ones you find, the Throwing Axe of Silence. It is a +3 throwing axe, so a rather big enchantment for chapter 2. And whenever it lands a hit on the enemy, they must also pass a fortitude saving throw of 14 difficulty class, or lose the ability to cast spells for the next 1d4 rounds. Now the difficulty class isn't really that high, but spellcasting enemies, especially wizards and other mages, don't tend to have high fortitude. And since this applies on every single hit, chances are the enemy might end up failing the save eventually. Finding this axe can be a bit complicated, and it is also very missable, but basically you have to solve the Altar of Desna puzzle in the Lost Chapel area during chapter 2. Now for those that might not know, this is the same place you have to go in order to recruit the succubus ARUESHALAE earlier, during chapter 2 instead of the beginning of chapter 3. Because of how important this quest can be, as it does let you recruit a companion earlier, I'll save the explanation for a guide just focused on it. Now chapter 3 is when the fun really starts for your dual wielding throwing axe character, because this is when we get the most powerful throwing axes in the game, and they actually come in a set of 2, so perfect for our dual wielding characters. First we have the Fixed Obsession throwing axe. It is a +3 king throwing axe and has the very unique property that whenever it lands a hit on the enemy Every single further attack on the same enemy will deal an additional 1 point of force damage, stacking up to a maximum of +10, which is quite a lot. Especially when you consider there is no resistance against force damage at all, no matter how strong the enemy is, so it's always going to deal full damage. This axe comes with another one, the Frost Embrace, which is a +3 Icy Burst throwing axe. Icy Burst means an extra 1d6 points of cold damage on a successful hit, which then increases to 1d10 on a critical hit, which can become even higher based on the critical multiplier of your weapon. My Wendug here has ×4, so that's a whole 3d10 extra points of cold damage on a critical hit, instead of just 1d10. Frost Embrace also has another very useful property of paralyzing the enemy for 2 rounds with a 24 difficulty class fortitude saving throw whenever it hits the enemy for the first time. Now, paralyzation is a very powerful status ailment. After all, the enemy won't be able to do anything while paralyzed, and it can be certainly fun when it works. Finding these axes is pretty easy, as they do come in a pair, and you can do it as soon as Chapter 3 starts. All you have to do is defeat the boss of the Winter Sun area map. I believe even if you make a deal with the demon Jerebath and spare the boss, you can still receive these throwing axes. So just complete the quest the way you see fit roleplaying wise, by either sparing the boss or killing him. And as usual, remember that at Chapter 3 you can also use the +3 version of Finian, which is also one of the most powerful weapons in the game because of the additional 1d6 force damage and the brilliant energy property that lets you bypass up to 9 armor class for most of the tough enemies in the game, even on unfair. Lastly, for our final throwing axe, we have Nordic Welcome, a +4 Icy Burst throwing axe, with another interesting property that whenever it hits the enemy for the first time in a round, they have to pass a fortitude saving throw of 27 difficulty class, or suffer a -3 penalty to damage rolls and become slowed for 1 round. Now at this point in the game the difficulty class isn't really that high, and it is just on the first time you hit the enemy. Still, it also has the Frost and Icy Burst properties for more cold damage on hit. And to get the Nordic Welcome, all you have to do is buy it from the Storyteller whenever you meet him in his tower during Chapter 4 in the Demon City. Now because you can only really get the Storyteller as a shopkeeper during that specific point in the game, I recommend you buy it from him, otherwise you end up missing this throwing axe in Chapter 5 and 6, so be sure to get it during Chapter 4. Honestly, if you were to ask me, the best throwing axes are the ones you get at Chapter 3, so Fixed Obsession and then Frost Embrace, but you can also trade Frost Embrace for Nordic Welcome later on when you get it. Now, if you were to ask me what I find to be the best classes for a dual-wielding throwing axe character, well, Fighter is always a solid choice. After all, we do have a massive amount of bonus feats, and we do need a lot of them for ranged weapons such as point blank, precise shot, and of course the 3 2-weapon fighting. Later on you can even get feats like snapshot and so on to let your ranged attacks proc attackers of opportunity, but I don't find it that useful. I would rather leave these for melee characters. Something interesting about throwing axes is that some of the rage powers from Barbarian and also Skald also applies to throwing weapons. They don't work with bows, but they do work with throwing weapons. For example, Skald and Barbarian Lethal Stance actually applies to thrown weapon attack rolls, which can increase your attack bonus further with the axes. Ranger is also a very solid class for dual-wielding throwing axes, especially the Demon Slayer archetype, because of the huge extra damage you'll get on hit against every single demon you face in the game, and they are the most common enemies in Wrath of the Righteous. Plus, you can actually choose combat style and then 2-weapon combat to gain all of the dual-wielding feats for free regardless of your dexterity. Although as I said before, I would recommend you have decent dexterity, because it does increase your attack bonus and chances to hit. And don't forget, unlike a fighter, a ranger also gets a very powerful pet as soon as level 4. And as usual, I recommend you go with the dog or the leopard early on if you're having trouble with the early game. Lastly, Slayer is another very good option. Just like Ranger, you can also get the dual-wielding feats for free regardless of dexterity through the Slayer talents, and you do gain an extra one every even level, so there's a lot of them, 10 at the end game. Slayers also get some sneak attack progression, which will apply to your throwing axes, any ranged weapon really. Lastly, through the Slayer talents you can also pick some very powerful rogue abilities, like Wearing Strike, which reduces your enemy's constitution and hit points by 1 per hit without a save, so very powerful even for hard and unfair. Or other useful talents like Dispelling Attack and also Opportunist. Now my favorite Slayer archetype is actually Spawn Slayer, because of the extra boosts we get whenever fighting enemies of large size and higher, and a lot of the powerful demons in Wrath of the Righteous are large and huge. But you can of course go with other martial classes, even something like a Skald, and I do favor throwing axes on Skalds or two-handed weapons, because for your allies to benefit from your Skald rage song, they need to be close to you, and throwing axes have way lower range than bow attacks, so chances are you will be closer to your party members. Skalds also have a lot of extra talents that they can spend in bonus feats, such as the dual wielding feats. Meanwhile, the best mythic path for a dual wielding extra character is certainly Trickster. Trickster means a lot of added power to every single one of your melee or ranged characters. Wendwag here, for example, has ×5 critical multiplier with her AXES, and also a massive 15 to 20 critical range. Notice how my previous Wendwag, who is in the party of an Angel mythic character, only had 19 to 20 with her throwing axes, so you will get a lot more critical hits when aided by a Trickster main character, and it can certainly make a very big difference in damage as you get a lot more hits. So just as far as physical damage, it's basically 70 something on a normal hit later on, and up to 320 damage on a critical hit. Certainly very powerful. Alright, so this was it for my throwing axes guide, everyone, and I hope this proved useful to you. If you've enjoyed this video, then please remember to like, subscribe, and even become a member to support the channel if you can. Also, don't forget to comment down below if you think I've missed some throwing axes that you find useful. Thank you for watching, and see you next time, friends.